During the Second World War, one of the greatest military clashes to take place was between these two mighty tanks, the American Sherman and the German Tiger. These two monsters went head-to-head in the D-Day landings in some of the most brutal battles the world had ever seen. Only one tank could be the winner. Which would it be? On June 6, 1944, the Americans, British, and their allies launched the D-Day landings on the northern coast of France. They fought bravely together against the common German enemy. The Allies' objective, to gain a precious foothold into Nazi-occupied Europe. With the coast secured, more hard work lay ahead. Allied forces, led by Sherman tanks, would still have to punch their way through German defenses in France, Belgium, and Holland on their way to Berlin. But around every corner, in every orchard, and in every hedgerow, the terrifying Tiger tank was lying in wait, aiming to stop the Allied forces in their tracks. The German Tiger was a landmark in Nazi military hardware. It was first unveiled on Hitler's 53rd birthday in 1942, and on the Führer's directive, it was to be bigger, heavier, and more deadly than any tank ever made. The German Tiger weighed 56 tons, and at the time was equipped with the largest gun to be fitted to a mass-produced tank. With its sheer size and devastating firepower, it soon took on a mythical status among enemy Allied crews.
I looked upon it as something indestructible, and if it was everywhere you went, if you passed a wood on your flank, say 1,000 yards away, you'd wonder what was lurking in there.
The fact was, it was a Tiger which was dominant in crews' minds. I'm sure people saw Tigers when they were there.
If he sees you, you haven't got a chance, have you? If you see him, you still haven't got a chance.
Because of the legends surrounding this beast of a tank, Allied crews soon came to fear its ominous angular shape and looked for it everywhere.
On this one occasion, we saw a square shape in the orchard, and we said automatically, that may be a Tiger. Let's not beat about the bush. Fire. And I fired. Very good first shot. And there was a huge explosion of splinters, and we realized we'd shot up one of the farmers' outside toilets.
At the same time, the Americans had been working on a design of their own. The Army needed a versatile tank which would ultimately lead the Allied assault in the planned D-Day landings. It was a vast improvement on Allied tanks that previously had been built. It was called the M4, or as crews came to know it, the Sherman.
My first impression of the Sherman, I thought was brilliant because the maneuverability of it, and as a driver, it had such a wonderful compartment, controls were good, and I honestly, my first impression, I couldn't fault the Sherman, really. I was very impressed with it.
The Sherman quickly became the tank chosen for mass production and used by all Allied forces, the Americans, Canadians, British, and eventually, even the Russians. And when on June 6, 1944, the Allies needed a tank for the D-Day landings, there was nothing better. The Sherman, trusted by crews and infantry alike. That was until it came into contact with the German Tiger.
But of course, we didn't know then what the Germans had, really.
No, but I was going to say, I don't think then I knew anything about Tigers.
Well, no,
at that stage.
They didn't tell us much about the Tiger.
No, they didn't, until we saw this Tiger, which had been captured. And it had 20 to 25 shell marks on it, where it hadn't penetrated. And then, of course, when you saw other tanks, other Shermans burn in front of you, you know, sort of utter competence about it.
And I used to count the graves, because they were often then just buried behind the tank or somewhere. And you'd see 2, 3, 5, and it was a 5, of course, they'd all gone. And that's really when my confidence began to slip a bit.
Was the Allied Sherman inferior to the Tiger? And did the Tiger's prowess really live up to its fearsome reputation? A contest like this would be judged on 3 main factors: firepower, armor, and mobility. Which of these 2 tanks would triumph in these categories? First, firepower. To create the Tiger, the Germans shoehorned their highly successful 88mm anti-aircraft gun into an armored body to produce an awesome tank-killing arsenal. The Sherman was not primarily designed to be a tank killer because its smaller diameter quick-loading artillery gun made it ideal for infantry support. And that's why the Allied Sherman's gun was so much smaller than the German Tigers, as were the shells it fired. On the left is the 75mm diameter high-explosive round of the Sherman. Impressive in its own right, but compare that with the size of the 88mm armor-piercing round that the German Tiger fired. The damage caused by one of these was absolutely devastating. The Tiger's gun was larger and more powerful in every way, capable of destroying an Allied Sherman at 1,500 yards. The Sherman's gun was so weak, it could not penetrate anything over 300 yards. It would have to get within a minimum of 60 yards to have a real chance of taking out a Tiger.
I didn't have the exact experience, but I've spoken with people who had the experience of being within 30 to 50 yards of a Tiger, firing the main gun of the Sherman, and seeing the shot bounce off the plates of a Tiger.
There was no greater example of the Tiger's superior range than at the Battle of Goodwood, 6 weeks after the D-Day landings. Perched on a hill overlooking the advancing Allies, the German 88mm guns destroyed a staggering 400 Shermans before the Allies could even get close enough to fire a shot on target. These men were there, on opposite sides. Ken Tout in an Allied Sherman and Heinz Bleidiesel in a German Tiger. Over the 2 days of carnage, Heinz's Tiger troop wiped out at least a dozen Shermans.
20 to 25 Shermans appeared, and we started to fire when the range was optimal, and every round hit a Sherman and they went up in flames.
Yes.
In a few minutes, it took us 30 minutes for 12 Shermans, and the other 2 had bailed out. They were undamaged, and we took them back afterwards.
So round 1, firepower, goes to the German Tiger with its lethal 88mm gun. Just as important as firepower was a tank's armor, and the German Tiger had an advantage here too, as military vehicle specialist Tony Lawrence explains.
The armour of the Tiger varied in thickness depending on what part of the tank. The frontal armour was up to about 4 inches thick, the side armour less, and the turret armour less. Even so, the frontal armour was impervious to pretty well anything that the Allies could throw at it. Really, the Tiger was a mobile pillbox.
To keep the Sherman lighter, the Americans used much thinner armor. In fact, almost half the thickness of the German Tigers. Experts will demonstrate the difference this makes here at an ordnance testing range in southern England. They've set up an experiment to replicate the effects of a direct hit from a German 88mm round on the 2-inch thick side armor plating of an Allied Sherman tank. The real measure of strength will be the potential damage to the crew inside, represented by these targets. High-speed video cameras will record the impact and show how well the armor stands up to the modern equivalent of the Tiger's deadly firepower.
Confirm range clear all round.
Range clear all round, clear red.
Stand by. 3, 2, 1.
The effects are devastating. The Allied Sherman's armor plating is too thin to withstand the raw firepower of a round fired from a gun like the German Tiger's 88. It has penetrated the armor, sliced right through the crew, and exited the other side. For a tank crew during the Second World War, the chances of surviving an impact like this were incredibly slim.
We were advancing through an orchard, but when we got to the edge of the orchard, I heard a gun was firing, which sounded like an 88, and I looked across about sort of 200 yards, and I could see a gun. Suddenly the camouflage came off it a bit, and they were firing at someone else's tank, possibly Nobby's or the other one next to you there. I sort of came a bit out of the trees, and then I could see that the gun was beginning to swivel around towards us. And of course, eventually, it was facing directly at our tank. We were sort of looking down the muzzle. And the next minute it fired and struck our tank up just above the right track. As it entered the tank, first thing I noticed was the shaft was light as it had punched through, and it was an almighty bang, as you may imagine. That was about, I suppose, this much from me, about a yard across the tank, and only about a foot from the co-driver. It struck the ammunition bin, went white hot, and then it shot out underneath and broke the track. But we all got out and we all survived. Extremely lucky. Must have been our lucky day.
Brian only survived because the Allied Sherman's armor was so thin, the German shell passed through the tank's wall and straight out the other side, without touching the crew. Few Allied soldiers were as lucky, however. Some who lived to tell the tale of their battle with a Tiger were faced with a grisly task, recovering the remains of other Allied Sherman crew. Wally Tarrant remembers.
The biggest part was down in Lisieux, where we lost 4 tanks in one street. So I come down because I knew them all, you know, and we went into the tank to try and see if we could find anybody we knew, and that was terrible, you know. You found a pair of shoes, and is that Track Pin Walsh? I thought. I said, he had big feet. I thought that must be him, you know. And then the driver I knew, and I thought, that's the driver. He said, yeah, but we got to be sure of it, find his tag, you know. And a lot of them was just called missing.
A German Tiger taking a direct hit from a Sherman round produced very different results. For German crews, the Tiger's thick armor made it a safe place to be.
When you were hit, let's say by a Sherman, you thought there was a lightning in your tank for a few seconds, except that sometimes I was thrown back a little bit. But afterwards, it was as if nothing had happened.
So not only did the German Tiger surpass the Allied Sherman in terms of firepower, its armor appeared to be resistant to anything the Allies could fire at it. But in time, all that would change. In the weeks after the D-Day landings, Allied Sherman tanks had been decimated by the devastating firepower of the German Tiger tank force. Stories of Shermans penetrating the Tiger's thick armor with their tiny 75mm guns were few and far between. That was until a British innovation changed the Sherman into a tank that could challenge the Tiger head-on. The Firefly.
The Firefly was a last-minute, desperate attempt to put a really decent gun into the Sherman tank. And the British had available the 17-pounder, which was more or less equivalent to the Tiger's 88mm. They tried to put it into the Sherman, found it wouldn't fit. And in the end, ingeniously, they got it fitted into the turret by doing a 90 degrees twist, and they were able to insert it into the rather smaller turret of the Sherman.
This is the Sherman as it was originally developed with a 75mm gun. This is the Sherman Firefly with a 17-pounder anti-tank gun. The pea shooter, the tank killer.
That ought to give them something to think about.
But it was too little, too late. The Allied Sherman Firefly, even with its superior artillery, was never produced in mass quantities, primarily because the Americans were reluctant to fit a foreign gun on their tanks. Rounds 1 and 2, firepower and armor, belonged to the German Tiger tank. Will the Sherman turn the tables when it comes to mobility? At almost twice the weight of the Allied Sherman, the German Tiger could only reach a top speed of 23 miles per hour. The Sherman was much faster and could go places where the larger Tiger would simply get stuck.
Shermans are very mobile. They were a reasonably fast tank. I've actually been in the Sherman getting up to about 30 miles an hour, which is quite a hairy experience. In the Sherman, you could go along any normal metalled road, cross-country. The Tigers were much, much slower, but also, of course, their weight told against them. At 56 tons, it's fine going along nice, flat, dry ground. Once you start getting into mud, they're going to sink. Once you start going over small bridges, the bridges are going to crumble.
The Sherman was perhaps much better, much faster. Our maneuverability was really inadequate. And the engine was too slow.
And it wasn't just on the move that the Allied Sherman was faster than the German Tiger. Its turret could turn more rapidly, an advantage that could mean the difference between life and death.
If you compare it with the Sherman, I would say the Sherman was much better. It took us 3 to 5 minutes turning the turret round by hand, and perhaps 2 minutes or 1.5 minutes by engine.
So although inferior in terms of firepower and armor, the Allied Sherman was vastly superior to the German Tiger when it came to mobility. Not only did the Sherman win this round, it also had something else, something colossal on its side: the full weight of the American automobile industry. And this car held the key to the eventual dominance of the Sherman over the German Tiger on the battlefield.
Here in the Detroit tank arsenal, we forged the armaments of victory.
Back in the U.S., everyone was working together to help the Allied war effort in Europe. Not only were the public playing their part, but in this golden age of cooperation, the big three car manufacturers, General Motors, Chrysler, and Ford, joined forces to take control of Sherman tank production. As a result, new Shermans rolled off the assembly lines using components taken directly from the automobile industry. For example, this Ford Pilot's V8 engine was also fitted to some Sherman tanks. This flexibility in construction, simple design, and massive manufacturing backup meant that in Normandy, destroyed Allied Shermans could be replaced in 36 hours.
When I was knocked out, I went straight back and they gave me a Sherman straight away, get back up.
Our tank was an older one than the one we'd lost, and it had been belonged to a squadron leader, a major, who'd had his head blown off in there, and they cleaned it all up and disinfected it, and that was pretty good. And they put us in that, and off we went.
The Germans didn't have that kind of industrial backing. In fact, it could be argued that one of Hitler's greatest mistakes was to have commissioned such an enormous and complicated machine like the Tiger, when much simpler tanks could have been built in greater numbers. For every one Tiger coming off the production line, the Germans could have afforded to build 3 of their smaller but lethal Panzer Mark IVs.
They lost the plot a bit. And this is the problem with all of their industry. They were still producing grandiose products right up to 1945, when they should have just concentrated on some of their proven successes and just concentrating on getting those out as quickly as possible.
The German Tiger was a complex, over-engineered machine, which shared few common parts with any other German tank. It took a long time to make, was less reliable, and had sparse ground assistance when it needed repair. In the field of combat, a minor fault could disable the Tiger. And unlike the Allied Sherman, a dead Tiger could not be replaced easily.
We had lots of engine trouble. In my Le Corps, after 100 yards, it was already broken down. So we had to wait for people to get it running again, who never came, by the way. You know? The war ended before they actually arrived.
Now a reconstruction of a typical tank battle will demonstrate how the Allied military strategists used the Sherman's superior numbers to overrun the defending German Tigers and to beat a path through Europe and eventually to victory over the Nazis.
Imagine a little scenario in Normandy. We have a Tiger tank here, sitting up in a hedgerow, hidden from the Allies. We have a troop of 4 Shermans crossing a field. The first one, his turret will be turning. They'll be on the lookout for anything suspicious. The Tiger would take him out straight away with 1 shot. The second Sherman, he'll realise there's an enemy gun or something in the hedgerow. He will probably try and aim a shot towards the hedgerow, roughly where he thinks whatever it is might be. But by then the Tiger has reloaded and has taken this one out. The third tank, he will have seen the Tiger by now. He will try and use his other tanks as shield. He will come round. He might be able to get a shot off. And he will make a beeline for a sunken ravine over on the other side. But by then the Tiger will have reloaded. He will have gone. In the meantime, the 4th member of the troop, seeing what's happening, he will know the only vulnerable spot on the Tiger is the rear. He will try and go round to the rear of the tank, and he will try and take out the Tiger from the rear. And we have 1 Sherman out of 4 surviving.
And just as the Shermans were sacrificed for the Allied war effort, so too were their crews.
I felt very expendable, especially when we landed in Normandy. And when you see so many casualties in Normandy, and every day we were having casualties, you did feel, is my number next, you know?
In the end, the Allies won the ground war by their sheer numbers. The Sherman was produced in massive quantities, almost 50,000 of them, but only about 1,300 German Tigers were ever built. In order to advance through Europe and onto Berlin as swiftly as possible, Allied generals realized that even if they had to sacrifice 3 or 4 Shermans and their crews to destroy 1 Tiger, they would still have plenty to replace their losses, whereas the Nazis would not. Based purely on numbers, the Sherman was the superior weapon. But given a choice between the tanks, the crews on both sides had a different view.
But I think I'd better say the Tiger.
I'd rather be in a Tiger myself.
I'd have to say it'd be the Tiger.
I think I'd go for the Tiger.
There's no question about it. I would always choose the Tiger.
This contest wasn't about quality, it was about quantity. Although the Allied Sherman was inferior to the German Tiger both defensively and offensively, the Sherman's superiority in numbers overran and eventually defeated all the Tiger tanks. In 1945, the Sherman led the Allied forces onto Berlin and to victory. And that's why the Sherman tank wins this great military clash. But this was not the only great showdown of war machines in World War II. 18 months before Pearl Harbor, the British were alone, fighting to preserve their freedom against the marauding Nazi forces. By the summer of 1940, Germany had total control of mainland Europe, and England was next on the list. The Battle of Britain was about to unfold. But before an invasion could take place, Hitler needed superior air power. Leading the airborne assault was Germany's most advanced fighter aircraft, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Meeting it head-on was the British Royal Air Force's brand new fighter, the Supermarine Spitfire. In the Battle of Britain over the English Channel, these two planes would clash for the first time. Which would prove superior? A series of tests and a head-to-head dogfight will demonstrate how they really compared. There are 4 traits which make a great fighter aircraft: handling, performance, firepower, and pilot survivability. Which of these two planes has combined these factors to its best advantage? This was a period in the Second World War before the US and Britain joined forces to fight and defeat Nazi Germany. For the moment, the Brits were on their own. By July 1940, the beginning of the Battle of Britain, the German Messerschmitt had already been successfully tested in combat and was the Nazis' prized possession. But what would the British pilots make of their new untested Spitfire?
Oh, I loved it. It's the most beautiful airplane that's ever built, I think. You didn't get into the Spitfire, you strapped it on and flew. The best part was it was so wonderful to handle. It was a viceless airplane. It had no vices at all. You could do anything with it, and it would do anything you wanted it to do.
Comparing the Spitfire's handling to the Messerschmitts requires someone who's flown both planes. And British Royal Air Force pilot Charlie Brown flies these two vintage aircraft in his leisure time.
The Spitfire is the ultimate carefree handling airplane. Getting it off the ground and getting it back onto the ground is a bit of a trick, I grant you. But in the air, it is the most benign airplane of any type that I've ever flown, of any type.
It was the Spitfire's trademark elliptical wings that gave it its responsive handling.
Take a look at those two airplanes. Look at the wing area. The Spitfire's got that wonderful elliptical section on it. And in theory, when you start to maneuver the airplane, you should get less drag. It is one of the things that makes the aircraft more benign, having that large wing area.
The Messerschmitt 109's wings were smaller and weaker than the Spitfire's. What's more, a fluke design feature of the Spitfire gave its pilots an overwhelming advantage. During extreme maneuvers, the wings vibrated heavily, warning that the plane was about to fall out of the sky and giving the pilot ample time to correct. The German Messerschmitt gave no such warning.
The 109 is definitely more of a handful. It is rather less gainly. There is less feedback through the controls. Perfectly fine flying machine, but compared to a Spitfire, it is very difficult.
You had to treat the Messerschmitt as you would treat a diva. You had to handle it with care, just like a raw egg or like something that needs to be loved and cared for.
Because the German Messerschmitt was more difficult to fly, its pilots were often reluctant to push it to the extreme. This fact could shed light on one of the most enduring controversies surrounding the two aircraft. Which could outturn the other?
In a turn, the Spit was better than the Messerschmitt.
I know the Spitfire could outturn the 109. You'll still find the odd 109 pilot who claim differently, but I'm sure they hadn't found competent Spitfire pilots against them. On 2 occasions, I saved my life by outturning a 109.
So which one was the tighter turner? Despite claims otherwise by Spitfire pilots, there is some evidence to suggest that the 109 could outturn the British fighter. But in a dogfight, only the most experienced Luftwaffe pilot would dare push his plane to the limits. 9 times out of 10, a Spitfire would outturn a Messerschmitt.
A number of times, a Spitfire being chased by Messerschmitts pulled a tight turn, and the Messerschmitt couldn't stay with it. And in some cases, more experienced pilots ended up shooting a Messerschmitt down.
First blood goes to the agile Spitfire. It was much easier to control than the Messerschmitt 109, which required experienced pilots to handle dangerous combat situations. Now, round 2, pilot survivability. A veteran German pilot is about to get into the cockpit of a British Spitfire, and a veteran English pilot into the cockpit of a German Messerschmitt. They've been asked to give their first impressions of their opponent's aircraft. First, Spitfire pilot Peter Fay enters one of the few remaining Messerschmitts in the world, currently undergoing restoration.
I feel very much more confined than I did in a Spit, but the control panel is very similar.
Next, Battle of Britain Luftwaffe ace Hans Eckhard Bob gives his first impressions of the Supermarine Spitfire.
Well, I must admit that I like it. It's pretty spacious in here, it's comfortable, and vision is good all around. Yes, I like this aircraft. I'd like to fly it. When the cabin is closed, you feel safe. But what is also important is your rear view, because that's where the enemy comes from. And when I turn round, I have good visibility on both sides, which is very important.
Visibility, not as good as a Spitfire. And if I look round, yes, I can see, but there's a definite blind spot.
This blind spot was caused by the bulletproof armor plate fitted behind the pilot's head, and many Messerschmitt pilots complained that it made them vulnerable to surprise attacks. This problem was cleverly rectified only after the Battle of Britain by the introduction of Panzer glass taken from German tanks, in place of the thick armor plating and still capable of stopping a bullet. But visibility wasn't the pilot's only concern during the Battle of Britain.
In dieser Maschine ist ja der Tank vor
The fuel tank is in front of you, compared to the Messerschmitt, where you have the tank behind and underneath you. If you were hit at the front in the Spitfire, then your face would burn straight away. In the 109, the fire would start at the back. Psychologically, that feels safer.
Right, my petrol tank is hit and I've got to get out in a hurry. It doesn't really matter whether the tank's in front of me or below. If I'm on fire, I've got to get out. And this thing is very heavy. And remember that we've got an airflow of 200 or 300 miles an hour, possibly more. So I have to get that open, and then I've got to get out of this thing. And I can only go this way. So if the flames are that side, hard luck. So I just get out as quick as I can.
Peter thinks it would be very difficult to jump out of a Messerschmitt if it was on fire. Ironically, Hans thinks it would be just as hard to bail out of a burning Spitfire.
I don't think it would be very easy to get out of a Spitfire. I could imagine this half door being pushed against you by the wind. In the Messerschmitt, it would be easy to abandon the plane because the force of the slipstream would help push you out. But luck also plays a part. The tailplane could easily hit you as you bailed out. But this is always a risk.
Although both aircraft were equally difficult to escape from, both pilots agree the Spitfire was more spacious and had better visibility than the German Messerschmitt. What's more, the Messerschmitt pilots were at a great disadvantage to their British counterparts when it came to landing the aircraft. The German Messerschmitt's landing gear was exceptionally narrow, and this led to frequent crashes on landing.
Flying the Messerschmitt was a big problem for beginners. As far as I know, we lost more pilots on takeoff and landing because of this narrow landing gear than through enemy attacks. Even if you're aware of this fault, it's still a problem. You need to be a good pilot to control a Messerschmitt.
Round 2 goes to the Spitfire as well. In terms of pilot survivability, the British Spitfire is a clear winner. Can the Messerschmitt regain the advantage in round 3? Firepower. During the Battle of Britain, the Messerschmitt Bf 109 led the German aerial assault on southern England. But meeting it head-on over the south coast was the revolutionary Supermarine Spitfire. Which of these two aircraft had the edge when it came to firepower? In 1940, along with the Hurricane, the Spitfire was the best-equipped British fighter with an armament of 8 Browning 303 machine guns, 4 in each wing. But the Messerschmitt had something far more fearsome, 2 deadly 20mm anti-aircraft cannons.
If you have a cannon, you only got to have a couple of shells hitting another airplane, and that airplane's out of action, in effect. Whereas bullets, you have to get an awful lot of bullets through that airplane to make it good. I can prove that with Germany. On one occasion, I think the last engagement during the Battle of Britain, when I shot down a Ju-88 over Salisbury Plain, I finished up the 11 bullet holes through my airplane. And they'd done no damage at all, although one had gone into the engine, whereas a cannon shot would have knocked me out.
To illustrate what this difference in armament means, experts at the Ordnance Testing Range will now carry out a modern-day test of firepower. This is the Browning 303 machine gun, the same basic design as the one that was fitted to the Spitfire during the Battle of Britain. To get an idea of what damage it would inflict in the air, this marksman is going to use it to strafe a piece of Messerschmitt 109. The aluminum in the frame is the same thickness as the skin of a 109's wing. A Spitfire's Browning machine gun just does not have the firepower to do any serious damage. The bullets have pierced the Messerschmitt's aluminum, but the holes aren't large enough to pose a real threat to the aircraft. A Spitfire was equipped with 8 Brownings, but you would have to be a crack shot to make them count. Shoehorned into the Messerschmitt's tiny wings was this, the terrifying 20mm cannon. The marksman will see what damage something this size can do to a simulated Spitfire wing. The Messerschmitt's 20mm shells have ripped the aluminum to shreds. Compared to the tiny holes made by the Spitfire's machine gun, it is devastating. If this really was part of a Spitfire's wing, the pilot would be bailing out by now.
I was scrambled and got into the cloud. If you're actually in the cloud, you can't see a blind thing until you're totally clear of the cloud. But I came up underneath 5109s. They were sitting there and watching me coming up and rubbing their hands. And they got me before I broke cloud, really, so I didn't know what was happening. They hit me from front and behind at the same time. A cannon shell exploded on the parachute I was sitting on, which put a hunk of metal through my right heel, which cut the Achilles tendon. So eventually I sort of managed to bail out and looked around and found the cord and pulled it with my one good arm. And very satisfying, that thump when the parachute opens. And then I looked up and I realised what the bang underneath my bottom had been, because the parachute was rather like a colander. It was one mass of holes. And so I came on down, and I was coming down very fast, as you can imagine. And I eventually came out of cloud about 4,000 feet over the most beautiful blue lagoon. And I was drifting towards an island in the middle of this lagoon. And I landed in they had a sort of quagmire in the middle of the island, which all the drains ran into. And I landed right in this. So I traditionally landed in the, as you can imagine. I came to with an Irishman standing over me saying, "What are you?" So I explained in my very basic English what I was. He then carried me to the jetty and the Navy picked me up.
Bob was lucky. He recovered and was back in action in months. Yet his story reinforces that during the Battle of Britain, the German Messerschmitt was clearly superior in terms of firepower. But could it beat the Spitfire in the performance stakes? During the Battle of Britain, Messerschmitts flying from their bases in northern France would typically go head-to-head with intercepting Spitfires at between 15 and 20,000 feet. At this altitude, the Spitfire had a top speed of 355 miles per hour, just 7 miles per hour faster than the 109. But despite the similarity in the two aircraft's performance, the Spitfire's Merlin engine had a major weakness, which undoubtedly cost some RAF pilots their lives during those aerial dogfights of 1940. Aeronautical engineer Peter Grieve tours air shows giving demonstrations of his Rolls-Royce Merlin engine. He bought it as a wreck 6 years ago and restored it to full working condition. And he can use it to illustrate the Spitfire engine's potentially disastrous tendency to cut out during steep forward dives. The problem occurred because the Spitfire's Merlin engine had a carburetor, whereas the Messerschmitt was fuel injected. With fuel injection, a pilot can do any aerobatics and the engine will keep running smoothly. But a carburetor's performance is affected by changes in G-force, which occur during certain extreme maneuvers.
What happens when you put a Spitfire into a steep dive is a bit like the feeling you get when you go over a humpback bridge in the car. Everything gets thrown upwards. In much the same way, on this Merlin carburettor, the fuel gets thrown upwards in the float chamber, starving the engine of fuel momentarily and making it splutter. The next thing which happens is much more serious. Because the floats which control the fuel flow into the carburettor are being thrown around, it makes the carburettor think that it's empty, and the fuel pump just piles fuel into it, in turn flooding the engine, which will make it cut out.
This kind of steep forward dive is known as a negative G maneuver because it reverses the effects of gravity. Using this wartime engine, Peter can demonstrate that the principle of negative G applies in exactly the same way as it would to the Merlin. When he turns the carburetor upside down, the engine cuts out.
Imagine that happening on your aircraft at 16,000 feet.
Crafty 109 pilots soon learned to exploit this failing of the Spitfire by deliberately forcing their opponents to follow them into a negative G dive.
It was a great advantage for us that we had a fuel injection system and the Spitfire was only equipped with a carburetor. When we had a Spitfire behind us, which we couldn't shake off, we would go into a steep forward dive, and the negative G would starve their carburetor, so we could dive quickly and the Spitfire couldn't keep up.
It was a fault that Spitfire pilots had to live with until well after the Battle of Britain. But the Spitfire wasn't the only one with a handicap. The German Messerschmitt had a crippling problem with fuel too, or more precisely, the lack of it. A major disadvantage that the Messerschmitt faced during the Battle of Britain was its limited flying range. The tank only held enough fuel for about 15 minutes fighting over southern England before the pilot had to head for home, which severely restricted the plane's efficiency as a weapon of war.
We had a lot of problems, and we often had to terminate our attacks because we ran out of fuel. The red warning light would come on, and you'd know you only had 10 or 15 minutes left. Critical if you hadn't started your return flight by then. You'd hear anxious cries over the radio from fellow pilots when they saw the warning light come on. From time to time, people had to make crash landings. It was a big problem for us, a big handicap.
In performance terms, it is a tie. Although the Spitfire narrowly won rounds 1 and 2, handling and pilot survivability, the German Messerschmitt dominated hands down when it came to firepower. There is really nothing to separate these two aircraft. But coming up, the final showdown, a typical dogfight between the Spitfire and the Messerschmitt. In the Battle of Britain, dogfights were dramatic and brutal. In 1940, it was quick, dirty combat. Whoever had the height, speed, and most importantly, the element of surprise, was more likely to kill and live to fight another day. For the first time, this modern simulation reveals how these World War II fighters would have performed in a typical Battle of Britain dogfight. The German strategy would have been to send a pair of Messerschmitt 109s to attack targets in southern England. The defending British Air Force's reaction would have been to send up a pair of Spitfires to intercept. This dogfight is seen from the cockpit of the second of the Messerschmitts. The four aircraft vie for position. Because of their restricted rear visibility, it is imperative that the Messerschmitt pilots get behind the Spitfires if they want to stand a chance of winning this dogfight. The Messerschmitts get the advantage they need, and a chase ensues. The Spitfire pilots, all too aware of the deadly firepower from their attackers' superior 20mm cannons, use maximum power to stay just out of firing range. But as the two aircraft are roughly equal in terms of top speed, the Spitfires cannot increase their lead any further than that. Now the Spitfire's supreme handling comes into its own. The RAF airmen attempt a series of evasive maneuvers to try and shake off the Messerschmitts. However, the one direction they cannot go is down. In a forward dive, their carburetor engines would cut out with disastrous consequences. Instead, they climb sharply and pull an inverted turn. But the Luftwaffe pilots anticipate this and have now closed to optimum firing range. A burst from the lead Messerschmitt's powerful 20mm cannon puts a shell through the Spitfire's fuel tank. Aware of the horrifying prospect of the tank blowing up in his face, the RAF pilot has two choices: bail out or make an emergency landing. Victory for the Germans seems certain, but before they can turn their attentions to finishing off the second Spitfire, a setback. The red lights come on in their cockpits, warning them that fuel is low. They have to head back to their base in northern France, and they assume the second Spitfire will return to its airfield in England. It would prove to be a costly oversight. Caught up in his success, the Messerschmitt No. 2 has made a grave mistake. He has neglected to spot the second Spitfire making a surprise counterattack from above, and so failed in his duty to protect the Messerschmitt leader at all costs. The leader's plane is now doomed. The second Messerschmitt pilot now has no option but to head back to base alone. The conflict is ended on equal terms, typical of many of the dogfights during the summer of 1940. In fact, the Spitfire and Messerschmitt were so evenly matched that this contest ends in a tie. As in many battles, the only real deciding factor was the man at the controls.
In the end, a lot depends on the pilot. If you imagine an experienced pilot flying the 109 compared with an inexperienced Spitfire pilot, then the pilot of the 109 would be superior. If the situation was reversed, the Spitfire pilot would be superior. It always depends on who's flying the plane.
You never knew what you were doing. You had a gun sight, and providing that little dot in the middle of the gun sight was where you wanted it to be, how you got there was quite incidental. That is why you had to learn to fly the airplane first, and why these chaps who arrived with 7 hours flying the Spitfires hadn't a hope.
By September 1940, after 3 months of conflict, the Germans realized that without aerial superiority, plans to invade England were futile. Many historians maintain Britain won the battle, but it may be more accurate to say that it was a stalemate. The Germans did not win, and the British did not lose. In just over a year, the Americans would join the British and other allies to defeat the Nazi forces once and for all.